Welcome to OECD Podcast, where policy meets people. From mapping our route to targeting advertisements, artificial intelligence is everywhere you look. But who is making sure that everything is regulated and that the rules are up to date with the technology? What is the role of governments in working together to understand and keep AI trustworthy? This podcast is first in a series on artificial intelligence, brought to you by the OECD's Global Parliamentary Network and the European Parliament's Panel for the Future of Science and Technology, also known as STOA. STOA brings together 27 members of the European Parliament from various committees to examine science and technology developments and their interactions with society. Later, I'll be speaking with AI experts Jeremias Prassl and Crawford to get their take on how to better regulate AI and the global costs and benefits. But first, Anthony Gooch, Director of the OECD's Public Affairs and Communications Directorate and Chair of the Global Parliamentary Network, spoke with Greek MEP and Chair of the STOA panel, Kaili, on why international cooperation and initiatives are vital to the expansion of AI.
Kaili, welcome to this OECD podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. And now you are the chair of one of the most important bodies in the European Parliament focusing on artificial intelligence. That's the Panel for the Future of Science and Technology. And we've been working together very intensively in the last few months. I'm very hopeful that we can make a difference in terms of this collaboration that we are establishing on a very, very important issue. Artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology. That's the formal term. That means it impacts every area of our lives. What drove you to prioritize cooperation in the European Parliament with the OECD, with UNESCO? There's so many organizations that you've also brought around the table and your work in the European Parliament and in the panel. Is that something that you always had clear in your mind, or was it something that grew?
I've been meeting people and everybody's a bit worried about the impact of AI and about how we might lose control, since artificial intelligence is not just automation, but it tends to be super intelligence, to become more autonomous and to go beyond even the human understanding. So it's really essential for us to prepare an ethical framework to be able to have the benefits of this technology and try to avoid the consequences. So I saw this emerging like you did, and I felt that joining forces could only help us move faster this time. I had the feeling that this could actually change the world to make it a better place.
We know that it's not easy to deliver on something that is human-centric and trustworthy. These are fine words, but then when you go about translating them into something real, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And on that point, there's a question that regards autonomy. When we talk about artificial intelligence, there is that notion of autonomy that's very connected to artificial intelligence, an intelligence that can go ahead and do things. And I wonder, from that perspective, you as a parliamentarian, and knowing the anxieties and the concerns and the fears that people sometimes have, what your take is on that question of autonomy. How do we reconcile the inherent autonomy of artificial intelligence to be able to get on and do things that we want done with that concern, which is, can we leave it up to a machine, a non-human, to do these things?
We have to strike the gold balance, to have a human-centric AI with human control, but at the same time to take fully advantage of what AI can bring. So I would say autonomy could actually be super beneficial. We need to find this combination and take the benefits of both. That's why I also believe we need to rush and create these common global standards before we lose control to that, and before we have, let's say, an autonomous system without safeguards that could take decisions or actually act before we have managed to understand why. Do you believe that this pandemic has accelerated things, and have you seen more challenges emerging?
It's a great question because I think part of what we're living now is a real acceleration and an amplification of the trends that we were both so aware of prior to the pandemic. Inequalities are not new, but perhaps it's quite recent to discover within more advanced countries like the members of the EU or members of the OECD that inequalities have grown quite significantly within our societies. I think we have an extra pressure now with the context of COVID to be up to the level of our ambitions and really to put these technological advances at the benefit of seeking also to narrow those gaps because we've seen the dangers that they bring. But the big picture is it's just amazing that we are where we are, and AI has played an enormous role in those advances. We've always talked about discovering a vaccine. Now we can talk about engineering a vaccine. So it's different. It's not hit and miss. And AI helps us with something like that. So I'm quite excited by that potential. You always have positives and negatives, but I do think that sometimes we tend to dwell on the negative elements a little bit more. But do you think somewhere that human beings judge machines differently and more harshly, perhaps?
That's a very smart and interesting question. I think basically this is the essence of how we can properly translate rights, human rights, to digital rights, since everything has a different perception when you go online, especially the need to have clear liabilities of who is responsible for a specific decision and how can the car be responsible for the accident and not the person who programmed the software or the manufacturer. So it's very difficult, and I have the feeling that we will have to take this challenge and follow through the time and see how the technology develops and progresses. And also I think it's going to be a case-by-case response, because still everybody is afraid of the anonymity of the machines. That's the problem. And they have the feeling that if something goes wrong, they cannot find who is to blame, who is liable for that. I have also the feeling that this is why GDPR has been a great success, because it actually forces whoever uses your data, and this is where the power comes from, to be reported, to know exactly who controls your data, who uses or shares your data, and how. So I believe what we need to do and achieve to have more trust and not to, lose ourselves into questions of trust again, is to have a GDPR also for non-sensitive data. And I have the feeling that with the European Parliament, we will work on this file in 2021, so before the end of this year.
We developed a series of principles, which I think the challenge for us now lies in turning them into something that is actionable. Those principles speak of benefiting the people and the planet. They speak of safeguarding the rule of law, human rights, democratic values, diversity. They underline the importance of transparency and disclosure, so we know what's going on with AI, that there is also recourse. We talk about the need for robust, secure, and safe AI, and to be able to assess and manage the risks that might emerge. And you were talking about security and privacy. And these issues are complex and difficult because you may indeed have trade-offs.
I believe that we will also discuss about how we can achieve safe AI without compromising privacy that we mentioned before. And this is something that I don't think many countries would prioritize. For example, like in some so-called democracies, the pandemic has been an alibi to control citizens, rank citizens, exclude citizens from the public sector, and so on. So this is what we want to avoid. So I believe we need to talk about new rights and new laws at this point. And I think 21 and 22 will be very important years for the European Parliament to conclude with our legislation. And I think if you have ideas of more rights, or like what is the emerging challenge that we might not see yet, That would be really important for me to listen to, since your experience and your foresight has been proven throughout the years. And I see biotech creating more challenges than I can actually believe I've already thought of.
What are you looking forward to from this project and this partnership as we chart forward in the coming months and years?
So I think what would be fascinating in the future is to understand and, let's say, use these technologies to give power again to people themselves in a positive way, and to avoid protectionism, but at the same time achieve the sovereignty that we need to have, since now we have a global environment. So I believe the parliamentarians, they are the ones who can bridge the gap between governments and citizens. If we enhance our work by international collaboration, so what we have already established could help us have a stronger voice for the citizens through the parliamentary network and forum, in order to not only set the standards for AI, but also to prepare for the next big challenge, and let's say for the fifth industrial revolution. I have the feeling also that it would be more in the biotechnology and the ethics there, and even just as a forum to exchange ideas and concerns.
And I think it's something that the OECD can certainly make a contribution to. We have global networks. We bring together regulators in these domains in competition all over the world, from consumers as well. And on the data front, we're building our activity very much indeed. So I think, again, that this is a sort of a match made in heaven if we play it the right way between the EU and its institutions and the OECD and what it can produce in order to achieve the goals that we have, where it's pretty clear that if you want something to be human-centric, to be trustworthy, to benefit the majority, that the more of us involved and the more connected we all are internationally in terms of ensuring that that's the case, the likelier we are to be successful.
The need of standards is really essential. And also, I speak in my capacity as the chair of the Center for Artificial Intelligence under STOA, the Science and Technology Options Assessment. And I bring here in our discussion the concerns of colleagues of mine from all the countries, so beyond borders, from different political parties. So I think since we share the same concerns, and since OECD is bringing together even more member states, we could only achieve the best for citizens by working together.
As we heard from Eva Kaili and Anthony Gooch, not only is AI regulation needed, but it requires going beyond borders and utilizing international cooperation. When it comes to AI regulation, it's more than a list of rules and standards. What is important for governments to consider? I spoke with Jeremias Prassl, AI expert and Deputy Director of the Institute of European and Comparative Law in the University of Oxford, about how we can improve AI regulation.
I think it's really important when we think about regulating artificial intelligence that we see both the advantages and the disadvantages that pop up. So I think very often when we talk about regulation, it seems to be driving either in the direction of enabling the development and dispersal of artificial intelligence, or the opposite, the sort of maybe banning things or putting blocks on things. I think one thing that's really important is that we recognize that neither of those two sides of the coin can exist without the other.
Would that be your message for the future of regulating AI?
There's another sort of even more important message out there about, the future of regulating artificial intelligence, whether in the working context or more broadly. And that is a strong sense of agency we need. I think sometimes when you think about the regulation, particularly of such fast emerging and powerful technologies as artificial intelligence, that we can fall into some sort of techno-determinism, that somehow, this technology, this development is something that is happening to us and coming our way. And instead, I think it's really important that, whether citizens, whether it's regulators on the domestic or the international level, we have this clear sense of agency. It's the choices we make today that will have huge path dependency in terms of ensuring that we get the benefit of new technologies without falling into some of the traps.
How can best practices be used in these initiatives? Best practices from governments and parliaments, how can that be embedded?
Artificial intelligence, machine learning systems do not come from nowhere. So I think one thing that's really important in order to embed best practices is right from the get-go, include various stakeholders. Now, that might include the developers of the software, but I think it's also really important that it includes representatives of those individuals, as it were, on whom the software will then be deployed, whether that's consumer organizations in the consumer context or social partners, trade unions, employer representatives in the context of AI at work.
Do you think this works as well for capacity building and decision making?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's an important lesson here, both in terms of education. And by education, I don't necessarily mean that we all need to become coders. Indeed, that is something that machine learning already is quite good at doing itself. But I think just having a sense of where the choices are and a sense of how we actually go about setting up these systems, that's really, really important. So my advice to any regulator would be try and find people in the room who both understand the tech, but also have people who understand what the broader legal implications are.
That sounds very important to have someone that understands both.
Absolutely. And I think it's about understanding the choices involved. Again, I say you don't have to learn Python. You don't have to sort of sit down and actually be able to set up these things yourself. But I think it's important to get a sense of what kind of choices are being made when training an algorithm, for example, and what impact they can then have on the functioning and what the various trade-offs involved are.
As Jeremias Prassl said, it's important to understand the power and algorithmic choices in AI when it comes to regulation. We don't need to be experts to write the rules, but we do need to understand it. But how can we ensure a fair distribution of costs, benefits, and opportunities in AI? Kate Crawford, AI scholar and author of the book, The Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of Artificial Intelligence, believes that no one is fairly accounting for the cost of AI.
First of all, we'd have to decide what are the costs and what are the benefits. It's so rare that you see a full tally of the actual costs of making artificial intelligence work. We're just starting to see, the first papers really be published that take a full accounting of the energy costs of AI. And then, of course, I mentioned briefly the labor issues in terms of the impact of AI on workers. The extraordinary forms of labor exploitation that happen along AI supply chains. We could think about crowd workers, but we could also think about the ways in which, workers are delivering parcels to Amazon and, being forced to submit to AI surveillance systems, inside the vehicles that they drive. All of these are costs. The question is whether they're being tallied. Certainly when it comes to the benefits, I think, it's much easier to see who benefits the most. And you could certainly say that, AI is enriching the very sort of top 0.00001% of the world. So there's something very important that happens in the middle, which is that we have to say, in the main, who is benefiting the most from these tools and who is paying the costs. And certainly my work and my research has been looking at the ways in which people who are already marginalized, women, people of color, in countries outside the West in particular, these are the places where we see the costs being borne the most. And again, that is something that is rarely told in the stories about shiny new AI systems.
So when you think about the energy and the labor costs, the labor exploitation, everything that you just mentioned, what is the role of multilateral initiatives, international cooperation, in ensuring that there are not inequalities?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen much by way of multilateral initiatives that are looking at the environmental costs of AI or the labor costs of AI through all of its supply chains. Frankly, the multilateral initiatives on AI are all very new and emergent. So we're still waiting to see where the consensus will emerge. But part of the reason I wrote Atlas of AI is to widen the lens on where we think we need these international agreements. So rather than simply focusing on sort of narrow technical definitions of fairness or transparency, to really start asking about these much bigger questions around costs and benefits.
Have you seen any sharing of best practices amongst various governments, international organizations? How is that working?
It's really interesting. I think there are certainly a circuit of experts and academics who are really good at sharing their work widely. And we have sort of channels through which we're all sharing examples and things that we think are working really well, and also where we're seeing gaps and limitations. But in terms of how, realistically, where you'd say, where is the international forum where this is best done, I don't think we have that yet. And I certainly would like to see a strengthening of sort of international collaboration. We're starting to see some moves towards sort of international discussion. But again, we have such a long way to go. And it's important, I think, that these sorts of spaces of discussion and best practices really do look at the much bigger picture, that we sort of, don't just look at ethics principles and guidelines and actually start to look at how do we deal with questions of climate justice in AI? How do we deal with labor rights in AI? These are the most pressing issues. And certainly, while they are complex, they're extremely urgent. So in that sense, I'm hoping that the next phase of international discussion and best practices will turn to those issues.
There are many pressing issues to address within artificial intelligence, but many benefits as well. As AI continues to expand and innovate, we need to continue the work of creating regulations and principles to make sure AI will be ethical and trustworthy. To learn more about the EU Parliament's panel for the future of science and technology's work on AI, go to www.europarl.europa.eu/STOA. To listen to other OECD podcasts, find us on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud.com/OECD.